Welcome to This Week, Next Week, Group M's podcast. We are excited to get started today. I'm Kate Scott-Dawkins. I'm joined by Jeff Foster and Nidhi Shah, breaking down the week's media, entertainment, commerce, news, everything all at once. How's everyone doing this week?
Doing well, thanks.
Doing great. Apart from the weather changing every single day, so not great in that way.
Everything is changing every single day, Nidhi. That's nothing new.
That is true.
Do you guys ever have those weeks where you have a plan and then something happens that just blows it all up?
Yeah, like every other day.
Yeah, that feels like every week
Every
these
day.
days.
Yeah, that's what happened to me with tariffs again this week. So we'll get into that in a second. We're going to talk about some of the U.S. economics and tariffs news this week. Jeff's been working on our media owner composite, so talking about media entertainment as advertisers, right? We often talk about them as the sellers of advertising. They are also large buyers of advertising. So we'll get into that. And then a look at the creator economy as well. Let's get into it. So as I mentioned, I had a good plan for this week, what I was going to be doing, preparation for our this year, next year forecast. Then we heard that there might be additional retaliatory tariffs on European alcohol imports to the US, with Trump saying there would be 200% tariffs on European wines, champagnes, and alcohols in response to planned tariffs of, for one thing, Kentucky bourbon in Europe. So that was definitely part of the news cycle yesterday. Are either of you connoisseurs of French wine or Kentucky bourbon, anything?
I mean, I do enjoy a good bourbon. I would not consider myself a connoisseur by any stretch, but yes, and do enjoy some good French wine as well. But yeah, it's definitely going to be, when these tariffs go into effect, it definitely will be raising prices. I've seen some studies and surveys just showing what the cost will be, and it's definitely going to put out of reach for most American consumers.
Yeah, I'm a lover of American craft beers, so I'm hoping that stays a relatively more affordable option. Of course, all these companies are also really heavily pushing into non-alcoholic options. Now, those might be produced in various number of places. But Nidhi, I mean, have you tried some good mocktails or non-alcoholic options?
No, I have not. I don't drink alcohol for all the listeners on the podcast, but I would be more on the chocolate front. So if we see that kind of tariffs kind of appear on chocolate, I will be very devastated.
Okay, for you, chocolate. Okay. Well, we did look at alcohol producers and advertisers. They are part of our broader CPG composite. We had a few already in the composite, but I spent last night furiously adding a load more just so we could get a better picture of global alcohol advertisers. We have 10 brands now in our composite. They spent a combined $19.3 billion US dollars in marketing, advertising, and promotional activities in fiscal year 24. That's roughly 22%. It's over a fifth of our total CPG composite. So, it is sizable when we're looking at the world's largest advertisers. And they tend to have a higher median spend on advertising as well than their CPG compatriot. Any sort of guess? CPG is, just about 5, roughly around 5. Any guesses for where the alcohol portion of this segment nets out in terms of median advertising as a percent of revenue?
8.
Pretty good. Yeah. If we take just those labeled as marketing or advertising expenses, because there are some that talk about advertising and promotional. We all know how difficult it is to get to apples and apples comparisons. So if we take just those labeled as marketing or advertising, a little bit of a narrower scope than including the promotional spend, the median is 8.7. And if we take everything, so including those that call it advertising and promotional, broader bucket of costs, that's up to 12.3% as a percentage of revenue. So, definitely a much higher intensity advertiser than traditional food and beverages, non-alcoholic beverages. Now that has been sort of mediating over the last few years. Again, there's been a shift, I think, in general to some more non-alcoholic options. Median advertising growth for fiscal year 2024 was just 0.4%. So, coming down off of those post-COVID highs that we saw across really all advertiser categories for the most part. So yeah, we have a few different tariff impacts, right? Canada, Mexico, those have already been instated, although with exemptions for some of the trade categories. There, you're looking at bigger impacts for Molson Coors or Constellation brands, which imports things like Modelo and Corona from Mexico. But the European players really, and we've seen this in terms of the stock movements as well, more so the LVMH, Campari, and then Heineken, Remy Cointreau. We also had Carlsberg in our composite, but interestingly, not a heavy US contingent. So less impact there. Looking at their US exposure, their US share is about 28% in terms of their revenue. Remy Cointreau, their America share is actually 37.8%. So a little bit higher. Definitely a mix of impacts, I think, versus the European-based players and the US-based players. We also added Treasury Wine Estates to our composite last night. They're Australia-based, but certainly eyeing anything else related to US imports. Their US share is 40% as of the fiscal year end in June. And they estimate the luxury wine market at $4.5 billion USD. There's another estimate from BMO Capital Markets that the entire wine market in the US is $107 billion. So yeah, some of that will be US based, but some of that is definitely imported from France, Italy, and other European markets. So we'll keep an eye on that. But yes, certainly a sizable portion of our CPG advertisers that are going to be looking at that very closely. So we also, of course, keep composites on a number of other advertiser categories. And Jeff, you were looking at one of those this week.
Yeah, so now that we're almost through earnings season and most companies have reported, we were just taking a look at our media and entertainment composite and noticed that the music subcat part of that composite saw strong growth in 2024. Of course, Spotify, which is a global streaming platform, grew about 20% year over year in 2024 in our composite versus about 8.8% of the composite, excluding Tencent and Live Nation. So I think it was pretty interesting to note, too, that Sirius XM, which saw a minus 2.8% year-over-year decline, and iHeart had a modest 2.8% increase. So I think you're kind of seeing a little bit of divergence between the global players and the regional local players. Like, what do you think? You think we're just going to see more of this?
Yeah, it definitely mirrors what we've seen in, I think, video as well, right? With the largest global players, the Disneys and Netflix and Amazons of the world, being able to, plow a bunch of money into content spend, being able to seek out global digital subscribers, versus more of those nationally and regionally focused players that don't have the same kind of scale, right, as yet for advertisers or for content spend and productions. So that's the challenge, I think, is where do those national and regional players go? Now, you mentioned Sirius and iHeart. That would include, I think, folks like Bauer in Europe. They're a private company, so they don't feature in our composite. But yeah, I think the question is what do they do? What are they offering to consumers and advertisers, right, to be able to compete in that audio space, which is, according to our forecast, flat-ish, certainly terrestrial declining with streaming still growing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think, if you're at a regional or a national audio station or group, do you kind of double down on going hyper local and trying to capture that market? Because how do you compete with the Spotifys of the world and the global players? It's just, it's a challenging business. So I think you might see more of an intense local and regional focus from the smaller players.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they should start courting those alcohol advertisers because they've been moving money into digital over the last few years, at least in the US. You and I were looking at some of the guideline data, but audio very effective, right, in terms of marketing effectiveness when we looked at some of the recent studies. So maybe there's an argument to be shifting back some out of digital and into these platforms like TV and radio, especially if you're working on convincing consumers to, help pay for those costs of tariffs if they do eventually get enacted. I can see, formats like TV and audio doing well in that case, right? In terms of building that brand prestige and brand equity on those very high impact channels.
Yeah, no, I agree too. I mean, I think, depending on how this plays out with tariffs, especially on the alcoholic beverage side, I think you might need to, kind of maybe reimagine your marketing approach and your advertising approach, and those, the audio channels could be a, good solution to that.
Yeah, audio, that's been one area where newer formats like podcasts have been a key source of growth, right? Again, even as terrestrial tends to be seeing declines in multiple markets. And that space has really opened up. I mean, it started with a lot of more traditional media owners. In the US, that would be folks like NPR. But now it's really expanded to what we might call sort of creators and influencers, right? That being a large portion of that podcast landscape and podcast growth. And Nidhi, you've been looking into the whole world of influencers and the creator economy recently.
Yeah, that's right. A very fascinating space, definitely. As a social media user myself, I'm always fascinated by the kind of different types of content that appears in front of me. But, really looking at the big picture here and, how the creator economy is kind of transforming the media landscape, reshaping how advertisers and consumers are interacting. You can take, for example, on social media, on news, streaming platforms, we're seeing increasingly tailored content to individual tastes. And, consumers are seeking out authentic and kind of more valuable content. You're seeing traditional media companies being challenged by the rise of some of these individual content creators, such as MrBeast, whose company is reportedly valued at about $5 billion, I think. And, this new dynamic is really exemplified by this week's news reports that YouTube creators such as MrBeast, Dude Perfect, and others will be hosting their own Upfront style event with Spotter later this month and showcasing their content to over 150 CMOs. We've obviously heard of TV upfronts in the US, but I think this is the first time I'm hearing of creator upfronts, and it's a sign of shift in the media landscape. I think it's kind of quite clear that the growing influence of these creators in the media landscape, brand deals are considered to be the main source of revenue for these creators, and this kind of upfront style event signals the potential for a shift from kind of that one-off brand deals to deeper strategic partnerships between creators and advertisers in the long run, which I think is very fascinating.
Yeah, I almost wonder they should have timed their social media soccer match better, right? Like they could have had, they filled Wembley Stadium recently. I was reading it was Casanat and MrBeast and all these guys playing a soccer match in Wembley Stadium for charity. I was reading the reports, there's not a set plan for next year, but maybe you can imagine they put it on in New York next time and actually tie in the upfronts to the soccer match. I could see something like that.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely very interesting. But as analysts, defining and measuring the space still remains a challenge. And I think there is so much variation in the size of the global creator economy estimates out there, from someone like Goldman Sachs estimating it at about $250 billion in 2024, to someone like Research Nestor, who has estimates of 189.7 billion. And it's kind of a challenge because the big question here is, what is a creator? How do we define it? That definition is so broad. And, creators can range from influencers who operate on social media to gamers, podcasters, bloggers. And I think as analysts, we kind of grapple with the blurred lines and diverse definitions. But I think out of all of this, it's kind of clear to me that the creator economy is now too big to ignore. And it's kind of a media channel in its own right.
Yeah. Push back a little bit maybe on like media channel, right? Because I think there are differences in how we define what we would call measured media, which is what feeds into our this year, next year forecast, right? And a bucket of things that have always sat outside of it. And so I think, yes, people tend to talk about them in the same breath, and this is true across a bunch of the industry, right? Creators alongside social media more broadly. And so we're going to do some work in, I think, this year's June report around helping to lay out some of this roadmap, right, as to where these things sit and why we either include or don't include them. So even though we want to size creator economy and influencer revenue, it does sit apart from the things that are typically in our this year, next year forecast, right? If we think about an analog to TV, where we have, the things that we're measuring in terms of media are linear and streaming TV ads. Now, of course, there are similarities. You mentioned the majority of influencer revenue coming from brand deals. So there is an analog in TV, right? There's branded content. There's the Group M project, Mazda, doing the Mazda Cup show with Amazon Prime. Looks very cool, focusing on female drivers and team leads. And we don't necessarily count that revenue if it's not being, disclosed as advertising by the media owners, right? So in that sense, the same. We don't count it if it's TV. We don't count it if it's influencer within social media. And the same thing if you have celebrity spokesperson fees with, say the Nate Bargatze DoorDash commercial in the Super Bowl. We're not counting what was paid directly to Bargatze for that appearance, right? The same way we're not going to count a brand paying a spokesmodel to post about their product on social media. So in that sense, I think those lines are fairly consistent for us. The question is, to your point, Nidhi, if more and more brand spend is moving into this non-measured media space, how do we get to a reasonable size and definition of the entire advertising world, right? So in that sense, you're very right. Do we continue to measure just the media portion of it, or do we need to look much more closely at things like brand deals and sponsorships, in general?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it becomes kind of complicated in a sense as well, that a creator is not just going to operate on one platform. I think you're seeing this era of operating on multiple platforms. How do you define someone who's a podcaster on, say, Spotify, who's like in the video space, in the audio space? So I think that's the kind of challenge as well, of the measurement side of things.
Yeah. Interesting. And lots of space for us to continue looking at these and looking at specific examples. I was reading about the Olympics this week. They just renewed their deal with NBC in terms of that media deal. So I think that'll all play into what we're talking about in the upcoming forecast too. But speaking of podcasts, maybe we can end this week with some recommendations. What do we have for our listeners? Something that you've listened to, read, watched recently? I know we've given a lot of TV show notes over the last few episodes, but any other recommendations that you've been enjoying recently?
Yeah, I've been a big fan for a long time for the Wall Street Journal podcast. It's always good just to get some quick hits on topics, and especially now with everything moving very quickly, I find that they do a really good job. The NPR one is pretty good. Planet Money is always a good listen.
Yeah.
And also 99% Invisible. Sorry, these are all falling more under the economic business category part, but I find it's just easy to listen to for, how 20-ish minutes and get a pretty good sense of a deeper topic.
Yeah. Yeah, same, like tech and business. I've mentioned Acquired before. Also the Big Technology podcast with Alex Kantrowitz. I was reading the transcript this week. He did an interview with the Roblox CEO. Super interesting. I've been really fascinated by the gaming engine, things like Unreal, Unity, Roblox for a while in terms of how they are mapping the physical space. I just thought it was really interesting. They're talking about using AI within Roblox to push the potential future of game creation using AI. So I'm going to read a quote from the Big Technology Podcast, and Roblox CEO Dave Baszucki. The North Star is not just object creation, but full-on experience creation, where one could imagine someone drawing a few sketches of characters, describing a few fun types of gameplay, and generate their own Roblox experience from that. So I think that's sort of interesting as we again talk about new media spaces and areas where advertising revenue is increasing but still quite small. That gaming is one of those channels to watch, certainly. And a real tie-in to my other recommendation, I guess, is actually a book that I just read. It was on the Information's end of year reading list last year. It's called Playground by Richard Powers. It follows a fictional creator of a social platform and really follows the rise of AI from the early days of this character working at the University of Illinois, similar to sort of a Mark Andreessen and the creator of Netscape, and then into the leader of this platform and really creating this story through his development of AI, and then the interweaving theme of ocean conservation and how those things are ultimately at odds in terms of the environmental impact of AI. So if you're looking for a good book, Playground, I would definitely recommend that. Nidhi, any recommendations to end on?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask for some recommendations for AI, really, kind of the tools and the operational side of things. I just recently used some AI tools for a speech I was writing for my grandfather's funeral, and I was just fascinated by the fact of how I could write the speech from English to Gujarati. So I will be actually looking for some recommendations myself, but looking on a lot of YouTube videos this weekend to see if there are any other use cases that I can experiment with.
Lots to find there for sure. Yeah, I think you'll find plenty to keep you busy. No worries. Now that cricket's over for a while, maybe that's a good use of time.
I'm still celebrating.
Oh,
so
sorry.
over India's win on Sunday, we had a big meal to celebrate the win. So lots of fireworks here as well. So
okay.
Yeah, I'm still in celebration mode.
Okay. Fair enough. Commiserations to our Kiwi listeners out there, I guess.
Yes.
All right, that's going to wrap it up for this week. We will see everyone again next week. Thanks for listening. This Week, Next Week is a podcast from Group M. All the positions and commentary are intended for educational and informational purposes only and are not intended as financial advice. If you have questions or comments, please reach out to business.intelligence@groupm.com.